So you guys came for your percentage of the $1 trillion, right? I'm assuming. I wish I got my percentage. So somewhere there's a clicker. There it is. Right. So sort of following along from what I mentioned in the keynote is this big enterprise world is different than, hey, if I'm going to buy the whole Kool-Aid of microservices and DevOps and containers and all those things, right? Big enterprise with that much money changes the picture, right? And so that's really what my talk is about, right? How do all these pieces actually fit together and sort of how to think about it? So rather than being a deep technical talk, it's more about the why and the how to think about it and what the trade-offs are and those kinds of things. I'm told there's not going to be an official Q&A session, so if people are really hot and bothered about some subject, just yell it out and I'll address it on the fly, or we can talk after the fact. Maybe? Maybe not. The big green light went on. No? Oh, now it caught up and ruined everything. Okay. All right, so who am I actually? This my daughter did a few years ago, so I have to put it on here to support her. I'm really a startup guy. Right? My background, I've been doing startups since the 80s, so I think that dates me. I'm a recovering neckbeard. My last startup was a company called Found, which was a big distributed data management platform where search was actually at the core. Right? So that's kind of the side I'm coming from, is big data systems. In that world, you have to deal with all the trade-offs, because there's no one perfect answer. And as a startup guy, I got to build the entire pipeline. I got to build the infrastructure. I got to run operations. I got to build the software. And so that's kind of how I got started in this world of process and operations and development. And so it was always natural for me to think of ops and engineering and support as actually just one big thing. Because when you're 3 guys in a garage, like, there is no different hat. Like, you just got to jump in and take care of the problem, and it doesn't matter. Like, I don't get to blame somebody else. I mean, I can pretend it, but that only goes so far, right? So a little over a year ago, I started talking with the CTO of Ariba about sort of what was next, right? What's going on? What's an interesting, meaty problem that sort of uses and can utilize my background and my knowledge and whatnot. And so he intrigued me because he said, look, Ariba's been around 20 years, whatever. It has a huge code base, huge legacy, very successful. It owns this procurement niche, makes a lot of money. Right? Now we need to modernize that. We need to make a generational change, which is very different. It's not just, hey, let's refactor our way to nirvana. It's, we have to go from the old world to the new world. How do we do that when we have 1,000 developers spread across the world and those kinds of things? So that was the hook that he played to my ego. It's really what it comes down to, right? I'm a Silicon Valley guy, right? So the vision to this audience is kind of old hat, right? We have a big monolith, legacy, multiple silos. It's big enterprise Java, right? So whoever has scars that I have, big enterprise, it accretes things. It becomes super specialized for the existing business, right? And that becomes more and more expensive to evolve. So whether you say it's more brittle or it's slower to evolve or whatever, one way or another, it comes down to it becomes more expensive, right? And when you say, great, now we're part of SAP, because SAP bought Ariba, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, the picture then becomes even more aggressive, because now you're part of the SAP family, and you need to go after bigger additional markets, complementary markets. You got to try new business models. You have to see this this world expand, not only to add more to the bottom line, but to remain relevant. Right? There's so much change out there that's happening in the business side of things. So we're a bunch of monkeys running around trying to make the business successful. Right? So no matter how you kind of pretty up the monolith, right? It's still opaque. Right? You have very narrow specializations that know, oh, I know this one piece of 20+ million lines of code base. Great. So what happens when that guy leaves? Right? And when you've been around 20 years, it's not just one generation gone. Sometimes you have 2, 3, 4 generations of people who've worked on some module, and that institutional knowledge is just gone. Right? And so one of the examples here is actually on the DevOps side. They built this whole custom infrastructure to deploy things written in a ridiculous amount of Perl code. Seriously, I'm not going to say the number because somebody will beat me. There's a lot of zeros in how many lines of code of Perl there is. And so again, institutional knowledge. People are afraid to touch that, so they add new features, even though we know there's overlap, right? That kind of thing. So obviously, the Kool-Aid is microservices and containerization. Right? That's the way to unlock the business value in all of this. Right? You have to, when you have 1,000 developers or whatever the total number is, you've got to break it down into smaller pieces. Right? So whether you call them microservices or some other approach, it has to become smaller and more independent, so that you can evolve them independently, right? So that you can add new ones and you can run more experiments and try things. And ultimately, then part of the problem comes back to how do you pull them back together and use them coherently? Mm-hmm. So the real goal is speed, right? So whether you talk about it in terms of latency, right? How fast do I go from thought to action to some kind of result? Or you think of it in lean startup terms of, hey, I've got a bunch of hypotheses that I want to roll through. Or you think of it in terms of, I want to go do experiments about new business models. Like, how do we unlock different parts of the Ariba ecosystem for our partners or our customers, different kinds of customers, right? We have ginormous customers, we have big customers, and we have just normally large customers. They all have different trade-off and needs. There's tons of customization, right? And so that kind of blend makes it hard to steer, right? You have to have a lot more invested. You have to have a lot more guide rails to actually be able to control this thing, right? So this thing is super fast, or it was, until they decommissioned the SR-71s, right? Their turning radius is ridiculous, because when you're going 3,000 miles an hour, it takes a long time to make a U-turn, right? Seriously, right? So it's all trade-offs. There is no perfect answer for any one thing. You have to be truly agile. You have to be nimble, and what do you bias towards? In this case, it's biased towards ridiculous speed at high altitude. Other things, you may say, oh, great, I really just want a moped so I can get through traffic in Bangalore, right? Totally different, similar philosophies, completely different manifestation, right? And I think that's part of the value of making this mindset shift to this notion of everything's a service and being able to deploy nice, clean chunks in containers. Right? The reality is, no matter what the promise of containers and all of that, the reality is more like this, right? Especially when you're in a big enterprise, right? And this is not to pick on Ariba or anybody else, but we all have problems. We all have legacy, right? We've all got this spackle, and we got to chip things away. And one of the big things that I've run into driving this project inside Ariba is all of the legal issues. there's jurisdictional issues, there's compliance issues, there's regulations. The Germans do different things than the Americans, and that's different than Japan. Like just cultural differences. They all play out, and when you're a truly global company, that you have customers and partners that really are in all of these different languages, in all of these different countries around the world, you can't just say, hey, we just support English, have a nice day. Right? How do you deal with that? How do you vet that we're compliant to the laws in Singapore and in Japan and in Switzerland at the same time? Right? And that's a key notion around the automation. We can't just automate hey, I'm just going to use Jenkins and push stuff out a pipeline that is really just engineering driven. It has to be legal driven. And so actually, a lot of times during the day, this is what I feel like. Right? And I think a lot of people have that, right? We run into some wall, and we feel like we're getting hammered, right? So great, I'm going to go sit in front of the auditors for whatever. PCI compliance, that's a popular one, right? Great, I'm going to sit there, and we have our team that just week after week, and it seems like, I mean, it's worse than the number of holidays in India. It's like every other week, there's 3 or 4 days where people just disappear. Well, where are they? We can't get any work done because they're on the critical path. Oh, well, they're in this audit. Well, they just did an audit. Oh, no, this is a different group, right? That's insane. Think about the friction that that's doing to your business, right? Think about all of the escalations that they can't deal with because they're in an audit, and when you're a big enterprise, you do a lot of custom work, right? So some big customer comes up and, well, they had an outage. Why? Well, I don't know. Those 2 guys are the only guys who really know what's going on with that particular piece, right? So you get this just constant friction, right? And that's just, you'll see this theme coming back over and over again. What we want, what the dream is actually to build all of these things into a pipeline that controls, hey, I'm going to do unit tests, I'm going to do functional tests, I'm going to do different kinds of compliance tests, I'm going to do source code analysis. All of those things I want to be able to do in an automated fashion. Not just because it's faster and it's automated and repeatable. It's because the fact is nobody knows all of these constraints, right? The people who know the PCI part is different from the people who know the various restrictions around jurisdiction and money flows and things like that. And so just codifying those into some format changes the nature of your business, right? So the dream really is you can move faster and be more secure and be more robust, but you have to make the investment to get there. Right? Right? So rather than keeping the suspense, here's the tools we actually decided on, right? So I spent a lot of time at my team investigating all the popular stuff out there, right? So actually, I didn't tell you, we just went to production last month. Full end-to-end stack. We used Jenkins, right, as our pipeline because we had people in the house that knew it very well. We ended up obviously using a lot of the Hashi tools. I mean, I like those guys, but I didn't pick it because they're nice guys, right? We did a lot of homework, right? And I'll get into various aspects of it, but at this point, the key is if you buy into these one-stop shop kinds of, drink the Kool-Aid, it's going to be great, right? You end up in things that have aspects of cults, right? We've all, I mean, seriously, think about if you've been in this business for any length of time, right? There's fads, right? C++ is going to save the world. And then people start learning about multiple inheritance in C++. And then what do you end up with? The reaction is Java. Good, bad, or indifferent. I've got a big history in the Java space, right? Good and bad. So when I can complain about it and feel okay. Great, Java is huge. Enterprise Java, bazillions of classes and all of that. So then what do you get? Hey, Python is cool, or whatever, right? Go and Rust and all these things. There's always fads. There's always going to be that. There's always going to be this churn. And that's another one of these key aspects is we're evolving. The markets are evolving. What the tools are doing are evolving. And buying into these one-stop shop kinds of solutions, right, is a big problem, right? And so coming to the Hashi tools is philosophically, they want to solve a problem, right? I'm an engineer. My job is to solve problems. That's how I see the world. I'm going to use that hammer, and I'm going to hit a nail with it, right? If I see a screwdriver, I'm going to go take something apart in my approach, right? So I came to this looking for how do we put the right pieces in place that can become the basis for a solution that can deal with the reality and all of the changes that happen. We also use some other cool new tools that people may not know about. The weird little thing on the very bottom left is a tool called Contiv from the Cisco folks. So it's like Flocker and Weave and those kinds of things. But another theme that I'll get into is everything needs to become policy-driven, right? That's a huge part, whether it's business policy, security policy, various technical workflows. If it's ad hoc or it's conflated, you can't adapt it, right? So you have to be able to extract, whether it's a specification or a workflow or a set of rules for a rules engine. We have to separate mechanism from policy. So I'll jump into that more. Right. So we talked about speed and reality, right? So no matter what you believe about reality, right, you can have whatever fantasy you want about moving faster, right? It's just not going to work, right? So these key aspects of how do we move faster, right? And what are the principles that will help us get there? One of them is agnosticism, right? So Mitchell and Armin talked about it in the keynote earlier, this notion of one workflow. Right? No matter what kind of environment I'm going to push my code to, from a developer or an operator or a tester perspective, it should look the same, right? So the fact that Ariba runs a whole slew of its own data centers on top of bare metal, right? That should be a business decision, right? Making trade-offs of, hey, I can get better density or I can get better performance for certain workloads or whatever. Great. Now, I'm gonna run that production environment because I want Oracle not running in a container. I'm going to run an Oracle cluster or a HANA cluster or a Sybase or anything else. I want to run it on bare metal to get the absolute maximum performance. Right? If you buy into everything must be containered, right? Now you've locked yourself into a straitjacket that's not actually providing you value, right? So you have to think agnostic, right? So in our flow, we're using Vagrant. We containerize Oracle for development use cases, right? But that means our tooling has to understand the difference of, hey, I'm gonna inflate this service on your laptop. So I'm gonna have to inflate a container with Oracle set up with your test data. That's completely different than I'm gonna set up Oracle in a shared private cloud, right, with a bunch of integration test data, which is totally different, again, from the, hey, we're the DBAs, we're running this production cluster in every one of our data centers around the world. with all sorts of extra paranoia around security and access controls and all of that because $1 trillion is running through that database, right? That's what I mean by agnosticism. So we really want one thing that controls everybody, right? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny, the one ring, but it's really one specification, right? If I have to teach things, if I have to teach teams the difference between AWS and Monsoon, which is the private cloud in SAP, and the bare metal data centers, and the different tools and processes and stacks, right, nobody's going to get anything done, right? So going back to latency, it's never going to get better, right? If we just change one set of constraints for another, right? So we have to lift that out, and right. I mean, I know they deprecated auto, but that kind of got a bunch of people thinking about, hey, I'm gonna create one abstract specification for each service, right? And so that's what we've built. My team at SAP is we have this single file that describes every container that is in that service, right? So you have, great, I have a front door, I have various database services, I have a Redis cache, I have a bunch of app servers and all those things. Each one of those is a different container type, and it's specified all together, right? So rather than just saying, hey, I'm gonna deploy these couple of containers independently of everything else, and then I need another orchestration layer to make sure I have the right balance of those. It's like, no, each microservice has one file. That is the definition of the service. And from that, we actually generate, Nomad specs and Terraform and AWS API commands and those kinds of things. And that gives us the freedom to then change it. Right? It makes it easy. Great, I'm going to inflate this on Vagrant. I'm going to go wherever. Right? That's how we get it. That's a huge difference. Right? If you look into how people frame, like the Docker world, right? If you buy into Docker Inc.'s approach of, hey, we have this one big thing and we're going to take care of all this magic for you. Great. Now you're stuck with containers. You cannot do our use case. You have no choice, right? That's just what their worldview is. And if you fit in that world and you're happy with that, that's fantastic. But if you have to look at this pipeline and this set of tooling that we're building for this generation, well, the last generation lasted 15 years inside Ariba, right? So my time horizon as the architect for this, I have to think 10, 15 years out. I can't just go, hey, am I going to make a bet today that Docker Inc. is going to win 5 years from now? And they're going to continue to solve my set of use cases. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's a whole separate discussion we can have after the talk. But give me another example. 2 or 3 years ago, OpenStack, right? OpenStack owned this huge chunk of mindshare. They were just like, oh, if you're not using OpenStack, you clearly don't know what you're talking about. Seriously, think back, it was everything. 2, 3 years ago, basically nobody outside Google knew anything about Kubernetes, right? And now it's completely switched. OpenStack is like, yeah, okay, it's kind of got its little niche, and people put that in their little niche. And now Kubernetes is the cool kid on the block, right? It's got the Google Halo and all those cool things. Well, great. Google's business model doesn't give squat about your company. They never have. All of their tools, all of their services that are not core to their business, they don't care about. People inside Google care a lot about it, right? Because that's part of what they care about. But Google Inc. does not care at all, right? So as you think about what tools you want to choose, you have to think about those kinds of sort of contextual and environmental decisions and how they're going to impact your company over time, right? And speaking of time, this is a cladogram of great apes because if you look at, if we even step back a little farther, right, this whole ops world, great, 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, some people yesterday, build everything from source, right? I'm going to ship source code in tarballs by hand to a machine, and I'm going to log in and do all this work, right? And then you get the next generation. Great, I'm going to put those in RPMs, and I'm going to let the RPM package manager do it for me. But it's still the same model, right? I've just automated the monkey part. I haven't changed how the system works. It's still basically static, and it's still update in place, right? Then you roll forward and you go, great, I'm going to take that to an extreme, and now you have Chef and Puppet and Ansible and Salt and things like that, where you have cookbooks and playbooks and all those, right? Everybody's got their own terminology. Okay, that's a nice step up, but now you're basically saying, great, I've taken the package management and I've automated the next level up, which is basically R shell, right? I just run it, and it goes over my fleet, and it just runs it for me. So one guy instead of 20, but it's the same set of operations, right? And as we then roll forward, into the more recent time, now we get into immutable infrastructure, right? We take this notion of containers and we codify it as that's the new atomic unit, right? Suddenly, now we can start building tools that don't care about what's the chewy center of that nugget. We just deal with, hey, the container has this clean API, and I can move it around, and I don't have to really care. I can create a bunch of services and then start composing that together. So now we actually start getting a real shift in mindset and being able to create leverage. And the key, what I would argue the key shift there is actually less about containers per se. To me, that's just an enabler. And the real switch in that is the change in mindset from basically a static view of the world to dynamic, right? And when I mentioned before, like I came through this from the perspective of what matters the most to me is actually Consul, right? I can change schedulers, right? They get more sophisticated and all of that, but service discovery, that's the heart of everything, right? If you really think about big distributed systems, everything starts with identity. Well, great, identity by itself means squat if I can't talk to you, right? So whether you think of it as a network guy and as a routing problem or a service discovery problem, I don't care what the terms you use, it's dynamic discovery is what really matters, right? That's the shift here. And that is really the thing that opens up a lot. As we look at the world in the past, right, we got to Chef and Puppet and Ansible and all those things. Now we get to the immutable world. Well, so what's going to happen now that we have this new sort of substrate that people are playing with is the rate of change is actually going to accelerate over the next 5 and 10 years, right? So as you're thinking about the rate of change and how disruptive that is to your business and your IT and whatnot, it's going to get even crazier. And so being able to evolve and plug out, hey, great, I don't like Nomad anymore. Screw those guys. I'm gonna put in Aurora, right? Or whatever, some 20-year-old writes next month. It doesn't matter. If I built a framework that, hey, actually my personal view is as we roll forward, different schedulers will be better at different kinds of workloads in specific environments, right? Because when I think about the scheduling pressure inside an infrastructure like AWS, where I actually have very little control of what's going on under the hood, and I don't know where things are really getting placed relative to each other. Well, okay, great. I know they're in the same AZ. Are they on the same rack? Are they tied to the same leaf switches? Who knows? For some workloads, completely doesn't matter, right? Totally irrelevant. That's awesome. For real low latency, distributed data pipelines, that's just death. Because now you have a whole bunch of jitter, right? And in some workloads, jitter is actually a bigger problem than getting an answer late, right? It's the not knowing part. Right? So a lot of these kinds of things, right? In our build out with Contiv, dealing with the network, the container networks and the storage networks, it's great. We get to write to this one spec. We can use Contiv in whatever environment we're in, whether it's AWS or Monsoon, because it's just software. But the cool thing is when we're in our bare metal, where we really care about performance and a lot of tuning, it ties directly into the Cisco ACI gear, right? Which is software-defined networking, and it's all this cool stuff. But I don't think about it. The guys writing our services don't have to think about it, because they just write and they say, hey, this container can talk to these other types of containers, and that's it. So we have this nice control boundary, we have this nice security boundary, we can audit all of that fun stuff and those things. But when I'm in an environment that can take advantage of hardware line speed support for all of those policies, that's really cool. And it becomes free, right? So just like this notion we were talking about Vault Enterprise in the keynote, right? A lot of this is how do we push a lot of this complexity away from the developers and the operators, right? So they just deal with this higher level piece, and then great, over time we just plug it out. Right? So I told you I'd come back to policy. So most systems are something like, Rube Goldberg kind of thing, right? You have a bunch of mechanism, you got a bunch of implicit policy, you have no idea why it's connected, you just know it is, right? Somebody made a decision, everybody's afraid to change it, right? Because it's baked in. It's not just hard-coded, it's the entire mindset, right? Oh, great, we built this system to be super optimized 20 years ago for our use case, and so we made everything single-threaded, so the code would be simpler. Okay, awesome. Now it's 2016 or whatever, and we need to go multi-tenant super aggressively. Does that mean I have to have a thread per tenant? Does that mean I have to have 100 threads per tenant? That's a whole different use case. Unless we separate that mechanism out from how we inflate these things and compose them, we're screwed, right? We're going to be stuck dragging these 20-year-old, 10-year-old, 5-year-old decisions into the future, and that's, again, going to create friction and not actually help us create more new leverage. Right? So unfortunately, my poor team, they hear this all the time. Separate mechanism from policy. Right? To me, that's actually the next round. Like we were talking about dynamic discovery with Consul. Separation of policy and mechanism is the next level of that same problem. Because now, if I'm building in a dynamic configuration mindset, and I separate policy from mechanism, that means I can dynamically compose and change policies, right? And whether that's at the granularity of the second, a day, like the Citadel guys, their whole workload is they're now changing their trading decisions during the middle of the day and rolling those out. That's a huge change in their business. Great, I'm a quant, I've created this crazy physics-based simulation model of the market, and I do all this testing, and I take some new data and I go, oh, if I tweak this one thing, we're gonna make more money today. That's a complete different shift. Right? So this separation of policy, whatever you want to call it, right? It's, well, I'm changing the workflow, I'm changing the parameters, I'm changing the decision matrix. Right, on the fly. That is the next level up in creating leverage for the business, right? And so you can look at it in different ways. You can look at it at every single level, right? Whether you're looking at state machines, I think this is the state machine of Jira or one of those, right? Low level, it's pretty straightforward. But what really we care about is business, right? We want to have things flexible up and down the business, right? So folks in big enterprises know and have to suffer through QBRs, right? These quarterly business reviews where people are like, well, do I invest more money in this team and this project or this other team and this other project or this technology or that technology? That's this dynamic problem that really becomes problematic when you have a legacy that can only change quarterly or every other quarter. When you move to a world that is much more dynamic and you're doing things like all these A/B testing and whatnot, you have to be able to react. Well, how do you react? You have to create the leverage to be able to dynamically change it, right? So that's kind of the big sermon piece from a technology standpoint, right? Is how do we separate those two? And that protects us against these evolutionary changes, right? What happens when Armin goes nuts and Vault veers off 5 years from now? Who knows, right? But I can plumb it in and out, right? I can always recreate the APIs and take it in my own direction, right? I can fork the open source version or whatever. I don't want to. I actually want them to do more stuff, right? I want them to add a whole bunch of other features or anybody else, right? That's the nature of creating a real ecosystem that we can plug these services in and out, right? Then my last big area, as you look at the tools and the companies and whatnot, comes down to community, right? We've all gone through the Emacs versus VI versus Eclipse versus whatever wars, right? There's always some form of that. C++, Java versus Scala, whatever, all of those. But when you get past the facade of all these geek trade-offs, it still comes down to what's the culture and what's the community behind it, right? Why do certain projects win? They don't always win because they're technologically better or not, right? Ultimately, it comes down to they resonate with a community that ultimately takes ownership of that whole ecosystem, right? And where we are today in this life cycle is we're right in the middle, right? We're literally in the middle of this radical set of transformations. There is no Microsoft, there is no Google that owns this, right? So we have to take responsibility for what we're using and how they evolve. Not just, hey, I'm gonna jump in with the latest fad, right? It's what's the community behind it, right? So when I look at tools, when I look at programming languages, right? Go versus Rust versus Clojure versus Scala, right? One of my things is I actually go into those news groups and forums, and I just see what's the nature of the community. How do they support each other? What's the culture? What are the values that are embodied in that, right? What are the principles that they actually live by, not what they spout? And so that actually was the final kicker for why I picked a bunch of these Hashi tools and why I picked things like Contiv, right? Because they came at it from a clear mental model, but they're building and they're supporting a community and a culture around them that I think is worthy. And coming to conferences like this, I think this is one of the interesting things that's happening in this sort of DevOps world, is that communities are starting to be created that aren't just, here's the latest fad, but rather, here's how we can work together and create value for me, for you, for my customers, for the entire ecosystem. So that's my real message, right? And I found this picture, which I thought kind of represented this really nicely, right? You've got lots of pieces. You've got, whether it's microservices or human beings or companies, it's the same, right? I mean, that's the underlying message of Conway's Law, if you really think about it, right? So come at it from any direction. And how we compose, how we interact, how we support each other, I think is what makes spending time, the short time of our lives on these kinds of things, actually not a nightmare, but something that's actually really cool. So, thank you. And I have 4 minutes and 44 seconds left. So if anybody wants to jump in, complain, please.
You made a comment about how you will put together some kind of description of the data file.
Yes.
Describe a series of containers and how they are connected together. I mean, that sounds like Docker Compose, but I don't think I'm referring to that. I mean, is there something other than Docker Compose you had in mind specifically? Not that you want to endorse any particular tool.
Yeah. No, so the question is this spec file that I was talking about to drive the definition of a whole service and all of the pieces of it. Docker Compose has some great features. Otto had some great ideas too, right? But they all have their own set of trade-offs. And one of them is they're not clear yet because everything is still so moving. This notion of policies, right? How do you articulate policies at the right levels, right? Of not just, hey, I want to stitch these two things together and they're part of the same pod, right? That's great. Okay, great. We're in kindergarten, right? We have to go to the next level, right? The business value is, I have this service, I want to figure out what's the right level of investment, right? And whether that's more people on the team, whether that's more machines, whether that's making it federated across the globe or independent silos. How do you articulate those kinds of things and have a tooling that starts to understand that? And there's nothing out there right now that does that. So I had to build it. Right? Our team has to build that ourselves. If somebody comes along and solves that problem, that's awesome. I'm happy to not, I'm not interested, as Ariba, I'm totally not interested in being in the DevOps tool business. Right? I do it because I have to, right? And so one of the things I've mentioned to a few people is kind of the bonus. Like what's the next level beyond policy-driven? Right, is sort of taking your question even farther. And as I mentioned, this notion of, like the quarterly business reviews and all those things, what the business guys care about is how do they make those decisions, those investment decisions, those, hey, which way do we go? How aggressively do we go after this market or whatever, right? So if you think about it from like the scheduler, and I want to schedule whole services across the world, right? Whoever closes that loop and ties in business metrics from the executive level through the telemetry of the services actually running and feeds that back so that you can close those loops and you can make those kinds of decisions, those are the people that are actually going to win this market. It's not going to be because, hey, I'm 5% faster at scheduling a container, right? Great, that's nice, but that's not going to drive the business decision. Right. Thanks, I appreciate it.